Well, people don't stay. I mean, that's the reality. You can have a diversity program, and I've seen it. You bring them in. But if you bring them in and then you don't make an environment where they can be successful, they're going to go somewhere else. And guess what? They're in high demand. And so they'll find a place where they'll fit in. Diversity, yes, you do have to do some of those things to break some biases. I agree that those are good strategies for breaking biases, but those strategies don't work if you don't have an environment where people feel like they can succeed and where they don't see people that look like them and have their similar backgrounds and that they can relate to.
Welcome to the Unscripted Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we are going to get an inside look at a woman service leader's journey from surviving to thriving to giving back. I'm thrilled to have with me today Corey Pruneski, who is the former president of CoolSys. Corey, welcome to the Unscripted Podcast.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be here.
So I had the opportunity to hear Corey speak at this year's Field Service Palm Springs event. I really loved your keynote because you were really just sharing your story, but in a way where you could point back to certain things that people could take something away from. So I really enjoyed it. We're going to sort of re-emphasize some of those points today, but get into some other things as well. So it should be a great chat. But before we get into my questions for you, can you just tell everyone a little bit more about yourself, your background, anything you want to share?
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm a mother of four. My husband and I, we have a blended family. So we have two kids that I got for free when I married him, which was awesome. And then I have mine too. And they are perfect stair steps. So they're all now adults. The oldest is 21, the youngest is 18. And this fall, we have four kids in college. So that's what I do in my personal life, is raising those kids together with my husband and their other parents. But I'm also a leader, and I've led in large organizations over the years. And I think that, you lead a family, you lead friend groups, and you lead at work. And so many roles that I fill, being a mother, number one, but all the other things that I do in my life help me with being a leader.
Yeah, often you learn things in those different realms of your life that really can help you in the others. There's these lessons that I think particularly with parenting, there's a lot of things you can take and apply to other parts of your life because it forces you to grow so much as a person and, expand your thinking, but also learn new skills and all of that good stuff. Most recently, you were the president of CoolSys, but as you said, you have been a leader in other organizations as well, and we're going to get into some of that. During your presentation at Palm Springs, you broke your story into these three parts. I want to talk a bit about each of those. And the first was getting in and surviving. Can you share a bit about that and tell us a little bit about your early career?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I've been 30 years now in the HVAC and R industry. I worked at Johnson Controls for 28 years. And I worked at CoolSys for nearly 2 years. Gives you kind of perspective on where I am. But when I got out of college, I had an engineering degree, electrical engineering degree. And I was really just looking for a job. And I was actually getting married. My fiance already had a job, had been working for a year in Schenectady, New York. I drew a 60-mile circle around that and applied for any job that was in that circle. And actually, Johnson Controls was on campus as a recruiter. And I got the opportunity to meet with them. And they had an office in Albany, New York, which was in that 60-mile radius. It was an application engineer. Actually, I think the first interview was sales engineer. I ended up in an application engineer job. But it was really important to me in that first job to be called an engineer. I worked so hard on my degree and I just really didn't want to give up the title. I was like, okay, that checks that box. And then the salary was right in the range that I wanted to be in. And for me, it was get your foot in the door and then see what happens. But I promise you, I never thought that I was going to spend 28 years there. I really just was looking for a job and looking for a way to support myself and be able to do the things that I wanted to do. And I'm thrilled that I actually was lucky enough to get that opportunity and then to make the most of it. So I started in the Albany, New York branch. I was an application engineer. I spent a lot of time on construction sites. In those early years, I would eventually become a project engineer, which meant even more time on construction sites. And for me, it was a really good experience. I know most people are like, oh, as a woman, you worked on construction sites. It must have been really hard. And I got to tell you, I was treated really, really well in my early career. I really feel like the people that I had around me, I had a mentor, somebody who had been there a long time. He was actually an electrician by trade, but he had moved his way up into a project engineer role. A great mentor, huge van. I was 21 years old or whatever when I started, right? And here's this big guy, and he taught me so much and was so willing to give back to me. And I really appreciated that. And I think it helped really accelerate my ability to learn my new job. And the other thing that was a piece of my early career is that I was very computer literate. I had grown up, actually, even for my generation, probably a little bit more computer literate than most because I grew up in a household. My dad was an engineer, and we had computers in the household very early before most people did. And so I learned computer skills really early. And so now my kids just make fun of me because I can't even get through my iPhone and figure out how to turn the settings on and off. But back then I was pretty good. And I got to do a lot of things. Like they would send me to the advanced training on different subjects. So I got an opportunity to meet a lot of people, to get to know what was possible in the organization, which I think I didn't know. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't had those skills. I also applied for a job that had no business applying for about 3 years into my career. And there was this job called the Area Quality Assurance Manager. And I had met the guy who had filled that role, who was moving on to something else. And he'd come by our office, and I would always work with him because he was responsible for the LAN, all right, a local area network. And so I would help him out with those things. So I really wanted to do that job. And it was one of those jobs that people don't really know what it was. And in every different area, which is like a geographic distinction, every area, there was one of these folks, but they did it differently. Okay, you're responsible for the technology, you're responsible for training the people, and you're responsible for doing process improvement. And I really wanted the job. And it took me a while to convince them that I was the right person for this job, but eventually I got it. And my husband and I moved to Connecticut to take on that role. And it was really my first big break and really exciting. But what was concerning is basically said, yes, I'm going to take this job. The guy who hired me called me, I don't even know if it was 48 hours later, and said, hey, just want to let you know, I'm leaving and I'm going to Pennsylvania, and they're going to bring in somebody else to Connecticut to take on this role. And I was like, oh boy, well, let's see what happens here. And I have to tell you, I got so lucky with that. And it's the thing about luck. I mean, I think about this a lot. And I was really lucky to get this particular leader at this particular time in his career and in my career. But I also worked really, really hard to be prepared for that moment. And so, I think that's what they say, luck is the intersection of preparation and opportunity. And this was one of those. So new leader, new to a GM role, and really trying to make his mark. And I got the opportunity to be a part of his team and to learn from him. And it was just a fantastic experience.
Very good. You said in your session that you were always confident, but you adjusted yourself to fit in or assimilate, even if not consciously. Can you share an example of how so?
Yeah. I mean, look, early on, I think the biggest thing is when you're a woman, I don't even know if this still happens today. I certainly would call it out if I saw it, but everybody seems to feel very comfortable with asking you when you're going to have kids. Like, oh, when are you going to have kids? And I was really conscious about this because I knew that there was a stigma around women leaving the workplace when they had kids. And so I would always say, oh, I'm never going to have kids. That was one thing. In fact, even on a construction site once, I was there with the project manager for the GC in his trailer and with a couple of the guys. And he says, oh yeah, we had a girl once too, but she had a kid and left. And that was so I was very conscious of that. But I fit in well with men. I mean, I always had. I was an engineer in college. I worked on the engineering degree. But really, since high school, I had always had a lot of male friends and had been in STEM classes. So I always got along really well with men. But I really did have a very domestic side to me. But I was very careful about not bringing those things up. And examples of that are my absolute passion in life, if you ask me, is food and cooking. I love to cook. I like to do things that most people didn't do in the 90s, like canning vegetables. I did those things before, that's way before COVID when everybody picked it up. But those types of things, making bread, doing those things, crafting around the house, that type of thing. And I was very careful not to talk about that part of my life. I always talked about other things. that I did, going out for a bike ride, going on a hike, going and doing things that made me just neutral, right? And not reminding them of my differences. And so I think about that a lot. And I don't think I did it. I don't know that I was totally conscious of what I was doing, but I really feel like I was leaving a part of myself behind. Now, anybody that works with me, I mean, they know that my passion is cooking. It's also a passion of many men now. So it's a much different conversation. And I have even several male colleagues over the years, so I swap recipes with and all of that. But back then I was really careful about that. I just didn't want to seem different. And I don't want to remind them that, hey, she's a woman, remember? Like, oh yeah, she's a girl, right? I don't want them to think that way. I wanted them to think about me as just the same as them.
Yeah. And so this brought us to a point of the difference between diverse and inclusive, right? And so what do you feel like leaders need to understand about that distinction? And where do you think some today are still getting it wrong?
Yeah, I still think it's very common today. I think that when you look at successful women, there's probably in most organizations that are male dominated, you'll find that they have a lot of the same characteristics of successful men. And I say that with a caveat because when you look at successful men, I think they have a wide variety of personality types. And I noticed that like introverted males did okay they could actually get into very high leadership roles and many of them quite successful. But when you looked at women, it was always the extroverted women. Like the introverted women they weren't climbing. There's things that were just not. And I think that still goes on today. I think there is still a lot of women out there who are successful in these male-dominated industries that find themselves assimilating rather than really being themselves. And I think that it's encouraged too because the guys feel really comfortable. I mean, when you don't care when they swear and, you'll sit down and drink a beer with them, you'll talk about the football game that just happened, all those things make them comfortable too, which I think is part of coming halfway. But I do think that it does limit the actual inclusion. And I think for many people, so this is just a woman's experience, but for people of color, for LGBTQ, they feel like they have to repress a part of themselves. In that case, it's like the core, like there's this core that they're not able to show. And I think that it's very disappointing. And I think that as leaders, we have to be able to recognize that, you know what, I see that person is different. And I know that it's not what I'm used to seeing in a diverse workplace. Maybe they have a lot of piercings or tattoos or blue hair. They're different, right? And maybe we feel like, okay, is that professional? Well, you have to drop that. I think that's where we can get better, is allowing people to be more of themselves, still professional looking. I do think that there are standards that have to be in place, but folks should be able to bring their whole selves and be able to be who they are. I had a friend in the LGBTQ community years ago before anybody even talked about it, right? And stood up in a meeting and introduced himself, and everybody had introduced himself. I'm married, I've got 4 kids and 3 dogs. And he introduced himself and he said he had a partner and they had dogs. And I thought it was so brave. And I've been friends with this man for a very long time. But at that time, that was a standout thing to do. And I think that that's where we have to be very comfortable so that people can really bring their whole selves to work. You get so much more out of people when you're able to do that.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I always say that the focus is often on diversity, but inclusion is the benefit of diversity, right? So the focus needs to be on inclusion, not diversity, because diversity on its own isn't doing anything for anyone if it's not an inclusive environment. That is really important.
Well, people don't stay. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, you can have a diversity program, and I've seen it. You bring them in, you get people in the door. You can set rules around, hey, you have to interview at least one diverse candidate for this role in the final round, or you can make sure that you're going out to places where you would find more diverse people, Society of Women Engineers, NASB, these organizations where you would find those folks. But if you bring them in and then you don't make an environment where they can be successful, they're going to go somewhere else. And guess what? They're in high demand. And so they'll find a place where they'll fit in. And I just think that that's diversity. Yes, you do have to do some of those things to break some biases. I agree that those are good strategies for breaking biases. But those strategies don't work if you don't have an environment where people feel like they can succeed and where they don't see people that look like them and have their similar backgrounds and that they can relate to.
Yeah. I think too, you said they'll go somewhere they can be successful. which is true, but also they'll go somewhere they can be themselves, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And it isn't necessarily always about fitting in, but about being welcome. We don't need to have a huge group of people just like us, because again, then we're not working toward the real value of diversity. But we need to create environments where differences are welcome and you don't feel like you have to be like everyone else to be comfortable.
I think just a little nuance there, I would say to me, is you do have to make some effort to meet people in the middle. I really think that that's important. Like, we can't just expect that folks, first of all, understand our perspective at all. And sometimes you have to make effort. And I do feel like that is why I probably made more effort than maybe was necessary or should be necessary, but to meet that middle ground. But I think that we as leaders have a responsibility to recognize when people are doing that and make sure that we're pulling them in and finding out what truly is underneath that person.
Yeah.
I think that's the key. Yeah.
Makes sense. I know you said that you had a really positive set of experiences in your early career. But when you think about like the surviving piece, getting in and surviving, is there anything you would note as what felt most challenging?
Yeah, I think that for me, it was always a surprise that either I was one, that I had an engineering degree, or two, that I was smart. It always made me feel awkward because it's the same thing as saying, oh, you're really good at math for a girl. What does that mean? Right? Like, those were the kinds of things I heard in my childhood. Oh, you're really good at math for a girl. I think that's what was a little bit hard early career wise, is that I felt like a bit of a novelty. In some ways, I benefited from that for sure. I'm not going to deny that, because it got me some attention that probably wouldn't have happened if I wasn't female. But I do feel like it was, they're always so surprised. There's such low expectations. I think that bothered me. And still today, I find that, reminding people that it shouldn't be a surprise that these people are smart, or they know their job, or that they've been around for a while, or that they have a big career just because they're blonde, or just because they're female, or they're Black, or they're Hispanic. I mean, I think that's part of the struggle as someone who, is underrepresented in the industries that I've worked in. I think that that's the thing that is most bothersome to me, and probably was the most challenging. And I think that, as a young person, you come in there like, these guys are going to try and shake you and everything. It is a challenge when you're faced with it, and you have to overcome that. And I think as you get older, you start to say, okay, well, my accomplishments speak for myself. Like, I don't need to prove anything now. But it still bothers me when people are surprised that I have a big job, or my husband stays home and took care of our kids. Like, that was the way we worked with our family. And it's always surprised that he would do that and refer to him as lucky.
Right.
They refer to me as it's a surprise that I was able to do that. Right.
Yeah. And those comments come a lot. I travel a lot. I get a lot of comments about that. It is interesting, the layers of assumptions or gender norms or bias that are really, really deeply embedded that we have to continue to question and push back on. To your point, without being combative, like, I get what you're saying about meeting people halfway, but there's a fine line between, you don't want to tolerate or exacerbate things that are really outdated, unnecessary, inaccurate. Unfortunately, it's a reality that, particularly as a woman, if you stand up to it, then you can be seen as abrasive or argumentative.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
That's right. Oh, I've been called all those things.
Damned if you do and damned if you don't, in a lot of ways. And it is tricky for sure. The next phase that you talked about was your thriving and advancing phase. Talk a bit about that.
This part of my career, as I got this big opportunity that I had talked about. First promotion, it was a big deal. And I got this new leader, and it just really turned out to be a great experience. And first of all, he was brilliant and just a really excellent leader. He had proven himself as a sales manager. This was his first time as a general manager. I was new in this role that we got to define really for ourselves. And he really took the opportunity to help and mentor me, not only be my boss, but also to mentor me. He encouraged me to go get my MBA. He was working on his MBA. He said, I think you should go get an MBA. I think it would really help you. And did that nights and weekends working on my MBA. And then he pulled me in to a lot of opportunities that some things that I probably wouldn't have known about in that role in most of the places that people serve that role. He let me help with the strategy and really help set the strategy for the business, which as it's still very young, a young person was just an incredible opportunity. He was an incredible boss. He was not there that long. He actually left, didn't leave the company, but moved to the next big role for him. And then we moved apart. I moved to Milwaukee to take on a job here. And he would eventually come to Milwaukee and actually I would work for someone who worked for him. And I was working part-time. Little known fact about my career, I actually worked part-time for 4 years, which was a real novelty at the time when I did it. My kids were little. I worked part-time and I was ready to come back full-time. Yeah, I was done working on project work. I was ready to get back on the train of career advancement. I was ready to get back into things that I love to do. And so I called him up and I said, hey, do you have anything for me? Because I'm ready to get back on the track. I'm ready for a director role. And he goes, oh yeah, I've got the perfect job for you. I didn't think you were ready to come back. He says, you're ready. I got it. This job is exactly what you did in Albany or in Connecticut. But what I need you to do is for this business, which Connecticut was a $50 million business and this is $2 billion. Right? So, and not a big deal. Just he made it sound really easy. And so I took the job. And again, just to